Good morning. It's good to see you all. And we'll also welcome the group, about the same number as here online. My name is Gordon Stedging. I am not Susan Couch, the coordinator. Susan is one of those people watching online from Florida. So we are sorry that she's missing our cold weather, but she's part of the class. Dave Koster really needs no introduction to HASP. He's presented for us a number of times, including our monthly meetings. Dave has over 30 years at BPW and the last 12 as general manager. And his degree is from Michigan Tech, and we're looking forward to getting the scoop on Snowmelt. Dave Koster.
Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, Michigan Tech should have prepared me for snow, right? And snowmelt. If you need a place, if you have a place that needs snowmelt, that definitely is one. But yeah, so it's really great to be back with you. I love the facilities here as well. I've done presentations for HASP in a number of different locations. The big group, smaller classrooms upstairs, I think was the last time that I was here, but this is a really wonderful venue, and you all have just a great organization and a great lineup of classes. So I hope to be able to further that and support that this morning. And again, thank you to those that are joining us online. Special thank you to Susan for reaching out to me and asking about this. And her husband, Dave, actually is now a member of our board at the BPW, supporting the perspectives of the township areas. They are residents of Park Township. And so, BPW is actually owned by the City of Holland, the Board of Public Works. It was put in place back in 1893, and it serves services, including electric, water, wastewater, and now we're growing our broadband offerings. Thank you to votes of the citizens of Holland here to make sure that we have fiber optic infrastructure past every home and business in our community over the next couple of years. So we'll be working on that. We find ourselves also having a role to play in snowmelt. And so snowmelt is a great topic, I think, to talk about. Visitors that come to Holland. Part of why they come to Holland at times is to experience, what we have going on here as it relates to snowmelt, and frankly, is an extension of our downtown. So I really want to just spend a little bit of time reviewing the past, how this really came to be, what were some of the challenges associated with that. So I'll talk through some of the history of the development, the decisions that were made, over those times. What we designed, how did we come up with the design of how, and how did we know it would work? Did we know it would work? I think you'll find out that there was a little bit of hope involved with some of that. We'll talk a little bit about as it exists today and the notoriety that it's received and how it benefits us. And then we'll get into some of the future discussions. Where is this going to go next? Really exciting things around the corner as it relates to efforts that we've done in Holland around waterfront development. And part of that is some discussions that we've got coming up on 8th Street, longer down that way. But also more maybe pressing in the near future is some discussions around 6th Street. And I'll cover that. And, I think snowmelt can play a part in some of those things in the city's plans as well. Then we have to think about how it functions and what are the issues for the future as relates to the fact that one of the key reasons that we have a snowmelt system is because we're able to provide waste heat, out of our electric generation. I'll cover how that works. But then think about that for the future, as our portfolio for electricity is changing and people are thinking about decarbonizing, trying to figure out, how to deal with the issue of climate change. And so, some discussions around that, I think. I want to make this interactive. Want to make sure that we're addressing questions that you have along the way as they come up. I know that Gordon will be available to come with a microphone. So, If you give a moment for him to get there so that those that are online can hear you as well. If you don't, I will be repeating the question back to if the microphone doesn't get there, I'll try to do that. But also we have an hour and a half here, and if you have other questions, especially if we get to the end here and we're getting into some Q&A, if you have other questions about the BPW and things that are going on, otherwise, I'm here today and I'm certainly available to you if you have questions that you're like, hey, he's going to be here. I want to ask him a question about something unrelated to Snowmelt even, and that's fine. I think once we get to the end of the presentation, we can do that. So I want to give some thank yous to people who helped contribute to this. A lot of information put together over the years. You know, I spoke to Andy Mulder. Anybody know Andy Mulder, former city attorney for us? Andy had done a couple of presentations in the circles that he runs in around Snowmelt, talking about the development. Andy did a really nice job putting that information together. I've spent some time with Andy going through that. Dale Weingarten, city planner and engineer for the city of Holland for years, especially over the time that some of these decisions were being made on Snowmelt, put together wonderful documents trail on that. A little bit about me. Again, Gordon mentioned 30 years with the BPW, degree from Michigan Tech in mechanical engineering. I came to the power plant as an intern for Michigan Tech in the summer of 1989, which was the summer immediately following the first operational year of Snowmelt. So a lot of discussions going on around that time. And certainly I've been in Holland. I went to West Ottawa High School. I've been in Holland for a long time, was able to know about some of the efforts that were going on down in the downtown. How many of you were here in Holland in 1988? I have a kind of a show of hands. All right. So, and many of you remember some of the disruption, that was in our downtown with some of the things that were going on there, right? So let's dive into that. Let's go back and think about that time in our history here. So picture yourself back in 1988, and probably every teenage movie that was out there, or a good number of them anyway, were centered around what's going on at the mall, right? I mean, malls were that big thing that was coming around and was really kind of a threat, to downtowns. Our downtown was kind of a tired downtown. It had, gone through some loss of some businesses in those areas. Again, you saw these developers that were looking at developing a mall. What's the advantage of a mall? Well, you get out of the weather, right? You get into an area where you can conveniently shop, and especially when we've got 90 plus inches of snow forecasted on an annual basis in our area. It's a nice place to go to get away from that, and you can do everything you want and then get out. It's also a place to hang out and congregate, and so you saw this effort to really put those kind of things in place. Back to the mid 1980s, there were conversations that were going on around building a mall around James and 31. The early developers of that kind of fell through. That some things didn't happen there, and it got revitalized a little bit. And an individual that was in the downtown or looking at the downtown considered possibility of an entity called the Holland Center to be located between 6th and 8th Street and between Central and College. So actually embedding a mall-like structure in our downtown. A lot of review happened with that. Some surveying of the downtown merchants. A lot of them saw that as more of a threat than a compliment to their businesses. And so it really got mixed reviews, and that development never was able to move forward. And that was going to be something that would have been more of an enclosed mall, kind of embedded within our downtown, about 250,000 square feet of area that was going to be. Later, Brahmalia developers, they were the sixth largest at the time anyway, development company in North America out of Toronto, revitalized this effort for the mall at the James and 31. And they were able to secure major anchors. And that was really what made that come to fruition, was they were secured JCPenney, Steckity, and then later an entity out of Wisconsin, Prangese, or later Yonkers, were sort of the main anchors for that mall. And that really allowed it to get going. And from that, there was a lot of concern among property owners in the downtown area. And a committee was formed to look at this out of some pretty influential property owners in our community. The entity, the Riverview Group, formed a special advisory committee to look at what we could do with our downtown to make sure that we could come up with maybe a new identity, figure out how to make this more of a destination and create a place where people would want to come to and overall look at that. So the concept that was born was streetscape at the time. And streetscape was really something where a whole revitalization of our downtown, trying to go back and tie the architecture of our building fronts to some historic connection to our past, figuring out how to make downtown more of a destination in total. So amenities that people could enjoy when they came down there, like simply, benches and small areas of respite, where you have, little park areas that are kind of carved into that. All of that was a vision that was created around that time, and some very important people at the Riverview Group. Gordon Van Wylen, obviously a very influential voice in that. The city staff, Greg Holcomb, who spent a lot of time in working with the Riverview Group over the years. A fellow by the name of Bill Johnson, who is still in our community and has done wonderful work in helping to create vision for place making in our downtown, created this vision of streetscape along with that. It was going to be about, to implement the vision, it was going to be about a $2.1 million investment to change the traffic flow, to create parking areas, to really just create this new vision of what our downtown could be. Well, another influential voice at the Riverview Group was Ed Prince. And I think, how many of you know the name Ed Prince? I imagine all of you in the room probably would know the name. Ed Prince is was a tremendously important business leader in our community, but also philanthropic voice. Put a lot of his own money into the community over the years to try to create a place. As a business owner, you want to make sure that your workforce enjoys the community that you're living in as well. And so there's an investment there that you want to make sure that you can attract talent. So there was that, but also property holdings that the Prince family had were important to continue to revitalize that downtown. Ed Prince came up with the idea of Snowmelt. Really, this is the genesis of that, and came from visits that he had to Europe in some of the Scandinavian countries that were there, where he saw that this was implemented in some scale, and thought, what a wonderful enhancement to really differentiate, to separate Holland from other communities, to create that special thing, that would set it apart. And so he came back with this concept, and he met with the group, this Riverview Study Committee, and wanted to pose the idea. This committee was really something that had been working on the implementation of streetscape for the last year. It's formed in 1987, and now we're talking about March 1988. And the reason that streetscape hadn't moved forward yet is they were trying to figure out the assessment process to pay for about 70% of the streetscape work to the downtown property owners, and that hadn't been finalized yet. So here comes Ed Prince with this concept of how to differentiate Holland. He says we should do this. We should put in a heating system for our sidewalks and our streets. And there was a meeting in March 1988 where this was posed, and the letter that he actually penned at the time to the mayor, a fairly new elected mayor, Phil Tanis, who I believe was about 18 years old at the time, one of our youngest serving mayors in the city of Holland. And the city manager at the time, Terry Hoffmeyer, was this concept of taking this effort and putting what was originally planned to be about a $550,000 estimate to build out Snowmelt and connect it to our James DeYoung power plant. So The Holland Board of Public Works, over the years of its existence, has owned electric generation. And in 1938, we moved from an area over by Riverview Park, actually, kind of where 6th Street and 5th Street are, down in that area. That was the original power plant back to the turn of the century in early 1900s. We moved over to the James Young site, and that whole area was reclaimed from swamp. A shoreline was created there, and the power plant was built. That was to be the source of some of the heat for the snowmelt system. So to build a conduit to bring the water down from the DeYoung plant to the downtown, and then between really just past River Avenue to the west, all the way back to where the old fire station was, so kind of between College and Columbia on the east. That would be the area where snowmelt would exist in our downtown and be a critical part of that. And what's interesting is that Terry Hoffmeyer at the time, city manager, pens this letter to the city council talking about this very simple concept of taking this hot water source and making it work for the benefit of melting snow. Nobody had really been sure that this would be successful or how it would be done and could it be done. This is March. And they're talking about doing this project over this summer. So there's a design process, there's a feasibility assessment, there's how do we get this all before the snow flies. You know, just think about that and frankly, the BPW general manager at the time, Tim Morowski, had gone to that meeting as well. Remember coming back and saying, what is this? And what is the BPW's role in this? And what, you know, is it going to work? And we want to tie into our power plant. How do we even make that happen? So all these questions, but this vision kept coming through of that this was a very necessary part of what would differentiate Holland from other communities. Well, I could just say that not everybody was in favor of this. In April, the Board of Public Works actually passed a resolution of neutrality. So it's kind of like playing Switzerland here, I guess, but they actually said, look, there's been no economic feasibility of this. There's been no request suggesting that the BPW would maintain the system. Bond covenants prevent the BPW from funding ongoing maintenance, and sufficient facts are lacking to render opinion on whether or not we should move forward with this. And so that was the, yeah, everything all right? Okay, good. So that was the situation that existed at the time. And so there was a request to try to put more certainty to this. A fellow by the name of Anders Reidecker out of St. Paul, Minnesota, came in as an engineer in the firm District Heating Engineering to look at a feasibility assessment here to see if this could be done. And they rendered an opinion that yes, it could, but the cost estimates for what they thought it was going to take to operate the system, which originally some of the early discussions that were done were around $50,000 a year. He was reporting this could be as high as $135,000. So now we're talking about significantly more expensive to build. And not only that, the $550,000 investment to build the snowmelt system was now going to be $1.1 million. So now all of a sudden, very early into it, you see the costs starting to escalate. Well, in June, the city council did approve it. And part of that approval was based upon the fact that there would be contributions made. Ed Prince himself put his own money forward on this. He offered about $250,000 to do that, provided that the city would match the $250,000, and that there would be an assessment process to recover the additional $600,000 that would have to be made up to close that gap to get it to the $1.1 million. And then in addition to that, the thing that sort of tipped it over the edge is that these operating cost escalation, Ed said for the first few years of operation, he himself would put $25,000 a year towards that operating cost as well. So with all that in mind, it was a very narrow vote at city council to say, yeah, we know we're 2 to 3 months after hearing this concept, but we're ready to put ourselves behind this thing and make it happen. Pretty visionary at that point, because, you know, the problem with an assessment, as Andy Mulder has explained to me as well, is that you can only assess properties if there's a benefit that accrues to that property that's commensurate with the assessment. Well, if the snowmelt system didn't work, you can't assess You can't assess if there's no value. So the risk was we build this and we're going to fund it based upon assessments, and then it doesn't work well. And all of a sudden we have an issue that is, what do we do at that point? So there were a lot of questions, probably more questions than there were answers yet at that time, but yet we move forward. One of the issues that came up too in the review of the feasibility study was that we would, in the design, was that we would take some of the steam from the DeYoung plant off from the system, and we would run it through a heat exchanger, get the temperature up to about 135 degrees Fahrenheit. And that would be the source of the water that would go down to the downtown. Well, some of the cost estimates started coming in on the equipment from the power plant, and then we saw the number of the 1.1 million potentially ballooning even further. And everybody kind of sit time out a minute. Let's not move forward. Well, fortunately, one of the staff members of the power plant that had been there for years remembered something. And this remembering was critical to being able to continue to move forward on the DeYoung plant. And that individual was Bob Trethewey. Bob Trethewey, former council member Mike Trethewey, has been on city council for a long time. That's Mike's uncle. Bob worked as our operations supervisor at the plant for years and remembered that, and you could see here, let me back up a minute because I want to take a look at this picture here. What you're seeing up in this picture is actually the condenser of one of the steam generators at steam turbine generators at the DeYoung plant, the oldest one that was in operation, and it was going to be the source of the Snowmelt system heat. Well, what you see, these large pipes that kind of neck down into the ground there, they're not going into concrete, they're going into a tunnel. That tunnel is actually breaking lake water in from Lake Makatawa, and it uses that cool water, pushes it through a condenser. The steam falls around tubes that are in that condenser, and that's what allows the steam to condense back to water so that it can be pumped back to a boiler and repeat the cycle of electric generation. In the process of condensing that water, heat is given off to the circulating water that goes through there. So normally the water would go back to the lake about 18 to 20 degrees warmer than what it came in. But if your water coming in is 34 degrees, just above freezing, and you have to heat it up about 18 degrees, that's only going to give you water that's about 54 degrees. That's a far long way away from 135 degrees that they said the system design needed to be. What Bob remembered was that there was a line that went back out and recirculated that tunnel. So instead of just being lost back to the lake, there was a way of creating almost like a closed loop system where we could warm up that tunnel. So instead of 34 degree water coming in, the water hitting the condenser was about 75 degrees, still cold enough to be able to condense the steam back efficiently. But then it would drive a temperature that would be closer to 95 degrees coming out of the condenser. Because again, you still get that about 20 degree rise. Now 95 is something that we can work with. And now we don't have to add any of the extra expense of a heat exchanger. But even better than that, we were going to take steam off from the process to a heat exchanger. Now we can let all that steam go through the steam turbine and come to the condenser before it actually is utilized, which actually improved the overall efficiency of the Snowmelt system too. Just a tremendous, remembrance of that allowed us to move forward. So again, yeah, the design of the system was set up to be where this lake water was, brought in, and it was warmed by the recirculation of that tunnel. And then we would pull it off the outlet of that condenser over to these pumps that are right here. And these pumps would take the water, and I'll have some pictures of what this looks like too, but the transmission lines, larger than this actually, this is a smaller version, but this is a high density polyethylene pipe. And so all down Pine Avenue, there would be a feeding line down to 8th Street. And then there would be a return line back to the power plant again after it was done using the Snowmelt. So that's how it would get down there to the downtown with about a 95 degree water to get it there. And then if you look at what's going on inside of the street, you've got smaller tubes there. This is what's called the distribution system. And again, the initial project was going to be about 3 blocks, a little over 3 blocks. It was going to run storefront to storefront. So it would include the sidewalks and the streets. And these tubes were actually to be spaced. Again, there's a company called Weerspo. They are a division, or their product is within a company called Uponor. And they actually build these things for private use, for commercial use, for different types of temperatures that are going into the system. And so they have a booklet that says, if you want to get the temperature of the street or the surface up to a certain temperature under a certain design condition for ambient temperature and wind, here's what you need. You need this much certain amount of flow through the tubes. The tubes need to be sized a certain size and they need to be spaced a certain amount apart. And so we did that to the 1-inch tubing that you see here. You know, it's basically like PEX tubing almost. And it is spaced at 6 inches apart. And that gets you about 90 British thermal units is a measurement of energy, about 90 BTUs per square foot per hour of heat exchange. That was forecasted, not proven, forecasted to melt about 1 inch of snow an hour under design conditions that are not extreme. At 135 degrees of water going into the system, we probably could have done more extreme conditions. As it exists, we knew going in that there'd be days where the winds are so violent, the snowfall is so heavy that the system would take some time to recover. At least that was the projection that was there. And so, you know, the system was designed because otherwise the costs of the system, both to operate and to build, would have been too high. So that was the design. Now we get into the construction. Okay. And the construction began right after a celebration on June 20, 1988. And it was originally planned to be coordinated phase by phase. They wanted to be as least disruption to the businesses in the downtown as possible, right? So we're going to do a block by block. We're going to do it layered where the BPW would go in and replace sewer main, water main, and then city would go in and do some work with storm sewers and things like that. And then it would be, the Snowmelt would be layered in on top of that. Well, that didn't go as planned. As it turned out, because of various delays that happened, one of the things that we found was that when we unearthed some of the sidewalks are there, we found some old coal vaults that were there when these buildings used to be heated by coal. So they would actually store this coal on site there, where those vaults all had to be filled in. So that caused some delays. There are things that caused delays. So what happened is, in reality, we had all 3.5 blocks torn up at the same time. And there were delays that were happening. At the same time, the mall was opening, and there was a 1/4 mile long backup of traffic in the northbound lane of US 31 trying to get into the mall. From Andy Mulder's discussions, again, Jim Tierman, it was Tierman's store downtown. So this was the worst period during the history of the operation of the store, because you're messing with people's patterns and for shopping, they're messing kind of with what they're accustomed to. And at the time, people had to find back doors. They had to navigate trying to walk along areas of the construction to get in. It was terribly challenging. So it took 3 years for people to kind of get back to the volume of traffic into the store than what they had prior to the work being done. That being said, we now have the largest snowmelt system in North America at the time, about 250,000 square feet that was put in, about 66 miles of that smaller tubing that I was showing there. And again, the way they do that, they put this base of this aggregate stone gravel, they put the tubing down on top of it. You secure the tubing, and today, actually, if you look at what's there, they have these stays periodically. Well, nowadays, they actually use this mesh material when they put in new area, and they'll actually wire the tubing to keep it firmly in place when you backfill with this sort of thing and the wire that you see here to tie that down. And you put on top of it, again, some sand and aggregate. And then what happens on top of that is if you're on a sidewalk, there were special interlocking pavers that you still see today. So anywhere you see the pavers in the downtown, that's going to be an area that is snow melted. Then under this, the street was actually a special asphalt material. And normally an asphalt is sealed. You want the water to cascade off because you don't want water penetrating and then freeze thaw. Well, this was not sealed, and it also had some various pieces of aggregate and things in it of different sizes to promote actually water seeping through. Good thing for stormwater runoff. You're not getting large amounts, running to the stormwater system. But in addition to that, you're creating a wet base underneath there. And if you have stuck your hand in an oven, it's not very difficult to do at 300 degrees, right? Try sticking your hand in a pot of water that's been on the stove for a while. That's a problem. That's because water is a better conductor of heat than not having that void of that medium there. So that water actually helps promote the conduction of that heat up to the surface as well. So that was specially designed, and you can get away with that because there's not going to be a freeze thaw situation in the snow melt area. So you're not going to get that heaving that's going on. So that was how that was designed. Everything's great, right? Well, no. We're learning as we go. And one of the things that we found out right away is that Lake Macatawa water isn't as clean as we'd like. As if we needed to know that, right? But the reality is that as the first winter was going on, the staff at the power plant are getting pretty nervous because they are discharging the water from those pumps and they can measure the pressure on that. And what they find is that during the winter months, the pressure is slowly increasing on there. That means that it's getting tougher and tougher to push the water through the tubes. What does that mean? Silt, sediment, things like that are starting to build up in these tubes. And we have these pretty small tubes, right? 1-inch tubes. So if you start getting silt and sediment, maybe an occasional fish part, I don't know. But if you get something in here that's going to start to clog that up, it's going to be a problem. And so the power plant staff was pretty concerned that we need to do something about this or we're going to be really flying blind here. And so they brought in some of the support that they have for chemicals at our power plant and also working with what our limitations were on discharging the water back to the lake, making sure that we didn't violate any concerns that were there from a toxicity standpoint. We found kind of a suite of chemicals that would help with this. A biodispersant, which would help sort of break down the surface water tension. So it'd allow chemicals to kind of get in and do their work. Biocides to help break down some of the algae growth or other, growth of things that could be living in the lake, plants and things like that. And then a coagulant. A coagulant is really necessary to help sort of bind together floating particles that happen so that you can move them through the system. It's called like a mud mover product to actually like get that to come through without clogging up in the system. Those things worked, but we also had to go in periodically. We would see areas, and the good news about a snowmelt system is it tells you right away whether it's working or not, because you can go and see these little areas where it's like, well, why is it melted all around it? But there's, this area of snow right here. Well, remember these tubes are going off in these loops, and they're coming out of manifolds. A manifold would look something like this. So we feed a zone, and we have zones because we're balancing the flow to all these different areas. And out of the manifold are these loops that come out. And so we could come in and quickly pull off a tube, and we could try to jet water through at a higher velocity, things like that, try to flush it out, and then we could put it back on and everything's good again. So we had to do that periodically along the way. The chemicals helped a lot, but we would find that still was something that we had to continually work on as well. And so here you see that example up on the side there where you've got this temporary apparatus set up to do some flushing activities that are there. Well, yeah, I remember at the power plant some of the early years, right, that you're operating this thing. And the other thing that's a constraint is that the heat source is unit number 3. It was a plant that was built, a generator that was built back in 1953. So even when the Snowmelt was just getting started, that plant was already 35 years old and getting older. And what happens typically in a power plant is that there are times that you have to take it down periodically for maintenance. There's also things that happen unexpectedly, like a tube leak in a boiler or something, where you say, well, I can't continue to let it operate that way, so I have to take it down. I remember that often, especially in the early years, the news crews love to come out and say, why isn't Snowmelt working? You know, Snowmelt's broken. Holland must have made a bad decision or something. They're looking for sensationalism out of that. And so I remember often the news crews coming out. And really what was going on, it wasn't the Snowmelt system, it was the heat source at the DeYoung plant that maybe the unit was down for some reason. And so we at the power plant kind of like to sort of change the way people looked at us to, instead of being an electric generator, we were a snow melting machine that happened to also produce electricity, you know. So but we've quickly found out the relative importance of you know, what the power plant was doing. Well, in 2004, again, this was so well liked that there was a request to do some additional expansion work here. And one of the things that was also in play was the fact that the generator that we were rejecting the heat from had a certain size to it. It was about an 11 megawatt generator, which meant that there was a certain amount of heat available for it to actually give off. And so that means the Snowmelt system couldn't grow too big without it sort of using up all of the capacity. So the city started being really kind of you know, careful about how it wanted to deploy, but also it said, look, it's working really well at this 90 BTUs per square foot that was in the original development area. Can we sort of stretch that a little bit? So here you see the farmers market area, and those aren't 6-inch spaced anymore. Those are about 9 to 10 inch spacing on them. Additionally, they're not 1-inch tubes anymore, they're 3/4 inch tubes. Remember that whole chart I talked about in terms of if you want to get here, it's got to be this size tube, it's got to be this. Well, now we're doing about 65 BTUs per square foot per hour rather than 90 BTUs per square foot per hour. In addition, we're doing that in an area that is more exposed to wind because you're out there in these big parking lot areas around the Civic Center, a lot more wind. Guess what? It doesn't work as well in some of those areas. So if you're ever down there and you're going, why isn't uptown? It looks pretty good, but here it's not as good. That's one of the main reasons for that. And it takes a little bit longer for it to catch up. There was also a key thing that happened along the way there too, is that to get hydraulically all that water up there, the transmission mains that we put in along Pine Avenue weren't sufficient anymore. So now we actually brought a secondary set of transmission lines up Central, down 4th Street, and then up Central to tie in at 8th Street as well. And that was a big addition. It took a lot of cost to do that. Here about $800,000 for these new transmission lines. And now you see the map there shows how we're not only coming down Pine Avenue, but jotting over to Central and coming down Central to tap into 8th Street. That allowed us to not only go to the farmers market area, but to kind of push out a little bit further for sidewalks down the rest of the way to Columbia and eventually around to the parking garage that's on 7th Street. And then also to connect down to the City Hall area and the library down River Avenue for some sidewalks. So all of that was added in 2004. And the city said, guess what? We don't have kind of as much cash around as we would like to. And so BPW, you know, you're already like providing the energy to us. And there's a fee that you're doing for that energy. And I'll get into discussing kind of how that works in a little bit. But they said, can we add another element to it where you will fund the transmission lines? And the transmission lines are everything up to those manifolds. So where the valves going into those manifolds are, that's all transmission line. Will you fund that? And then on the rate that we pay you, will have a capital recovery mechanism in it. So we'll pay you back over time, and that'll get, put into the Snowmelt system charge. And I'll talk a little bit about how it's paid for here in a little bit. And the BPW agreed to that. So the BPW shift that ownership over for the transmission lines at that time. But we also put another $150,000 into upgrades at the Young plant because we were running out of pump capacity. The pumps were really designed for the flow rate that what the original system was. So now we got to get a little bit bigger. So we put a new 150 horsepower pump in at the plant as well. And again, you see some of the additions. So after those significant expansions, this is what we have now for a BPW system at that time. So if you've been around Holland for a while, you know that back in around 2010, there was a pretty significant community level process that we went through to look at the fact that our old coal plant was aging, was getting to a point where it needed big investments from an environmental control standpoint to continue to survive. And we went through a stakeholder driven process to evaluate what should we do with that power plant? What should we do in our community for power supply going forward? And we went through a stakeholder driven process called a sustainable return on investment analysis. And that sustainable return on investment analysis considered not just the financial impacts of our power generation decisions, but also the social, economic, and environmental considerations to the community that would happen with that too. And so things like Snowmelt were actually considered in that evaluation, because if we decided to shut down the Young plant and then didn't build anything new, where would the heat come from for the Snowmelt system at that point, right? That wasn't the only driving factor for it. There were other driving factors, but we made a decision at that time that we would let the DeYoung plant, James DeYoung plant, retire, and that we would build a new natural gas combined cycle plant, which is a very efficient type of power generation source, and that we would build it at another location so that eventually the waterfront could be, enabled to be redeveloped in some way. And so we started that process really with construction going on at the new plant in 2015 to try to get done by early 2017. We burned our last piece of coal in April of 2016 in the power plant. So we got through the winter season, and now we have this period of time between 2016 and the start of 2017. But by the way, the new plant won't be completely done until the spring of 2017. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But what are we going to do? Because now we have a new power plant that's going to be built, and it's not going to be on the water. So we're not going to be using Lake Macatawa water anymore. So that's great, because now we don't have to worry about some of these sediment issues and plant growth issues and all that. But we have a system that's run on that lake water for about 30 years or so. So we had to clean. So in the summer of 2016, tremendous amount of flushing was going on. Additional to that, we found that 30-year-old valves that hadn't been exercised in a long time, started to have some problems. So we did a lot of valve replacement out there in the system as well. So we got ready for that. And we were excited because we could integrate now Snowmelt up front instead of having it being an afterthought and have to sort of figure out how to get it integrated. We could build it with that in mind, which also meant that we could build some backups to it. And at our power plant, we now not only have the same sort of process of rejecting heat from a steam turbine generator, but when it's not operating, we have a backup boiler that's there that can provide steam to a heat exchanger, kind of not too dissimilar to other concepts that are used in other communities where there is not a power plant. It doesn't have to do that very often because the plant's been very reliable, but we did build that in. We pushed to get Snowmelt done. The project for building Holland Energy Park was getting delayed a little bit. We're getting nervous because snow's coming. Fortunately, the auxiliary boiler and the pumps to serve that and the interconnecting lines to serve that were done on December 5, 2016. Holland's first measurable snow was December 6, 2016. Nobody knew anything different until I'm telling you today. So, but we were very nervous because, how many years is it that you can wait till December 6th for any measurable snow? So that was some really good news that occurred. So making the transition to Holland Energy Park was no real small endeavor. These are the big, so we talk about that size there. These are 36-inch high density polyethylene lines that are coming out of the Holland Energy Park. And the device that's up here on the side, you see that little collar that's around it. That's what fuses high density polyethylene pipe together. So it's actually like heat welded together. It melts it and pushes it together to form a solid joint. And when it cools, it basically has the same properties. That's a very thick wall pipe. You can kind of see the one that's sticking through the sleeve that's there, because again, we had to build underneath railroads. You know, it was discussed earlier, we would actually have to do put in like a casing in there of steel that would allow us to sleeve in the high density polyethylene through that particular area to give it additional strength. And so we did this. It was a cost of about $4.2 million. And of course, it was partly the decision of the BPW to move the plant to the location it was. It made sense for us to build at that location from a fuel supply perspective. It would have been tough for us to bring a high pressure gas line all the way to the old DeYoung plant. So part of that decision making, which caused this, was on the BPW. So there was agreement between the city and the BPW that the cost for this new interconnection would be split 2/7 to the city, 5/7 to the BPW. Additionally to that, the city had its own additions of Snowmelt that were going at the same time. Now we have 9th Street that has snow melted along the street, along the sidewalks. The Martha Miller Performing Arts Center has areas that are snow melted that are in that area. I'm sorry, Jack Miller Performing Arts Center. We have other areas that are related to Central Avenue. Very major contribution from an entity called Heart of Holland to help build the connection all the way down to Evergreen Commons was put forward to the city. Because if you can think about it, our cost, and I'll get to how we pay for it in a little bit, but the idea of passing residential units with Snowmelt was sort of the first time. Everything else had been sort of principal shopping district, downtown merchants, restaurants, things like that, where there was an interest in having that walkability to bring people in to their particular venues. Now we're talking about moving it down Central Avenue, and who's going to pay for that? So Heart of Holland came forward and with a $500,000 donation was able to make that occur. So now we have this Central Avenue connection all the way down to Evergreen Commons. These all became new additions to this capital recovery that we have between the BPW and the city. So today's network, as it exists, and this is pretty much as it is now, is about 5 miles of unique snow melted pathways to walk in our community. Nearly 690,000 square feet. So you think about the 250,000 that we started with, we're now on almost triple that. 600,000 gallons a minute when Snowmelt is operating. That's how much is flowing through out of the plant and back and into all those various zones that are out there to serve the system, rejecting about 56 million BTUs per hour in total. And for the first time, we've integrated this with building heat at the Civic Center. So part of the Civic Center's renovation work, they wanted to put a heat pump in. Well, a heat pump typically uses groundwater, and even at 50 so degrees, groundwater has heat available that it can give off to a heat pump to drive building heat. Water that's 75 degrees from the exit leg of this, or the exit leg of the Snowmelt system going back to the plant is even better than 50-degree water as far as a Snowmelt or as a heat pump system. So Civic Center integrated that in at the time that they did that. So let's talk about how this works. I'm going to geek out here a little bit on you. So just want to kind of cover everything. The diagram over on the left side as I'm looking here, pointing all the way to that side. You're probably looking at it, your right-hand side. That's the depiction of what's going on at the power plant. And if I don't know if I'm going to get off camera here for people at home. Am I too far to go this way? All right. So I'll just come over here so I can talk about it a little bit. Holland Energy Park is what's called a natural gas combined cycle plant. And so at the front end of that, there are large jet engines, basically. This is pretty much the same thing that hangs underneath the wing of an aircraft. They're called combustion turbines in the electric generation world. And they compress air coming in. And then after the air is compressed, fuel is introduced in these nozzles and burned in that location. That combination of that pressurized combustion gives energy to a set of blades that do two things. They drive the compressor on the front end, so something has to provide that power. But then also at the very front is a generator. That generator is producing electricity. It's connected to the grid. And so the turbine area is really providing enough power to power all that. Coming off the back of that combustion turbine, the gases are still about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's enough heat that you don't really want to waste that up to the air. So you can take that and put it through a device called a heat recovery steam generator. It's basically just a fancy word for a boiler. Instead of burning coal to make the heat in the boiler like we did at DeYoung, we're taking the waste heat from the combustion turbine to make steam. This steam then comes over to a separate generator, steam turbine, very similar to what we had at the old DeYoung plant. And so for no new fuel being burned, we were able to get about 50% more electrical output out of the steam turbine than what the two combustion turbines are doing alone, making it a very efficient process. And then again, remember on the back side of that steam turbine, you have to condense the water back to liquid again. So we do that in a condenser, which gives off heat. And normally that heat would be rejected to a cooling tower. And the cooling tower we have sits on site. Some of you probably have seen it. Once in a while, there's a vapor plume. We've actually designed it so that that's very limited amount of time because we don't want to create the same situation that exists in Zealand where they're closing the road. So we actually did special design in that. But we can also take some of that heat now and we can divert it so that it goes through the streets and sidewalks of our downtown. This turbine, the steam turbine here, is about 45 megawatts of electricity. Remember the old steam turbine that was the oldest unit at DeYoung was about 10 to 11 megawatts. So there's that much more heat available, which has allowed Snowmelt to grow. It's the reason Snowmelt has been allowed to grow. These diagrams depicted another way where it's really the four essential areas of what's called the ranking cycle. So a thermodynamic cycle. And in the ranking cycle, your heat is rejected. This is the Q out. Work's done here in the turbine. And the heat is rejected from the condenser. This diagram sort of depicts it here. A lot of that heat comes from the phase transformation. Everything on this side of this curve is steam. Everything on this side of the curve is water. Everything under the curve is the transformation of steam to water. And in that transformation, there's a lot of energy that's rejected in that. And so that's what you're really, the principle at which you're taking advantage of that. In other communities, we don't have this, right? The idea here is that in other private uses, in other communities, you have a boiler that actually just produces the steam or hot water for a snowmelt system. So you're directly firing natural gas or some fuel to do that. Very expensive from an operating standpoint. Here that we're using the waste heat, so we're getting a lot more out of that. How many of you have been to Holland Energy Park? Oh, that's wonderful. I encourage more of you to go to that. HollandEnergyPark.com or our Holland BPW website. You can find ways of connecting with a tour that's there. We do host events from time to time, but you can also, with a group, request a tour. We have in there taken people through the plant floor, but also we have a visitor center there as well, where you can have in a safe, quiet way, ability to see what's going on. This is the actual steam turbine generator here. And then this is the snowmelt pumps that we have today. Again, more efficient because the snowmelt pumps that we had before were a single speed. These are variable speed pumps. And these variable speed pumps are able to regulate up as the snowmelt system grows. We can increase the flow rate that's going on. And then up in the corner here is our cooling tower. And you can see, I don't know if you can barely see, but the one line that's coming up and coming over that's sort of shrouded in some insulation is the Snowmelt line. And down at the bottom of that is a high efficient screen that's there. Because we cleaned out the system and flushed it as much as possible, but we wanted to make sure we got all the impurities out. So when the plant was built, we put the screen on there so that we could continue to clean the water as it flushed through the system. And we were able to do that. Here is the auxiliary boiler that stands as a backup. And then again, our exhibitry in the visitor center, we created an exhibit for the Snowmelt to demonstrate it. That's the line that will leave the power plant with a 95-degree water, the actual line that connects in with the high-density polyethylene lines that you see under the areas that I was showing that major excavation going on. That exhibit allows you to divert the energy from the cooling tower to the streets and sidewalks and watch the snow on it actually go away. And so kind of a cool way of demonstrating that. Also, it's fun that we've been innovating over the years. I don't know if any of you have heard of smart bricks before. Anybody hear of that term? So smart bricks were the idea of Pete Hoffswell. Pete is actually in charge of our broadband department, but works a lot with different groups, innovation groups, kids, that are working on things, the Lakeshore Makers Group. Pete came up with a prototype for a smart brick, kind of started with, to try to measure the performance of the Snowmelt system out in the field. So we have an idea what it leaves at, what it comes back at, and we can visually see whether the snow is accumulating or not accumulating. But we really didn't have good surveillance of what the temperatures were out in various parts of the system. So we wanted to create this idea of having these things embedded out there in a way that allowed us to see that. So Pete's gone through some evolutions of this. He received the Innovator of the Year award from Grand Valley State University for this. And some examples of it now that we have. It's kind of a cool one here where we actually are going to put this one right in place of one of the pavers that were there. This is like a 3D printed model of it. But essentially what it has is it has a device that you can drill into the brick, maybe about an inch below the surface of it, and it will read the temperature of that brick at that location, come back to a low voltage transmitter. One of the things that we tried at first was like more of a cellular transmitter, where we're finding that it lasted about a day. The batteries would die. So just like your cell phone at home, right? So with this low voltage transmitter, you can get closer to like a year of performance out of that. And then we thought, well, the idea of having it actually in the surface where people could maybe fuss with it is not so good. So we actually moved now to where it's embedded in the manholes, where the valves are to the system, to the loops that are there. But you can see which brick we've drilled into. If you are very careful about what you're looking for, you can see there the brick that's up in the corner there has a embedded logo of BPW in it. If you see that, that's one of the bricks that we're actually measuring the temperature for. And then the graph that's there is showing the outdoor temperature, wind speed, and then the temperature that the brick is reading. So we can figure out correlations of that out there in the field. That'll allow us to trend over time. Are we getting any issues with condition of what's going on in the tubes? Are we finding that we're not getting as much flow rate to areas that we should have? Those are things that we should be able to keep a better eye on due to some of that innovation. And again, here's the other thing I will mention about this too, is that we thought we had figured everything out by doing the closed loop system, having clean water. Then what we did is we said, look, we're going to put a device in it, an anti-scaling chemical in here, so that calcium doesn't start to build up, because we're dealing with potable water yet. There's still some hardness in that. So we want to make sure that doesn't start building up some scale on the tube. So we have an anti-scaler in our water. Well, we found out that anti-scaler works really well when the water's flowing. But in the summertime, when we shut the system down, all of a sudden the anti-scaler stopped working. So we started getting some precipitation of scale out on our tubes. And then in addition to that, we actually found that we were getting, the tubes were heating up during the summer because the sun's beating down on it and then cooling off at night, beating down, heating up, cooling. The cycling that was going on was actually flaking the scale off. Well, scale are like these shards of brittle. It's almost like a peanut brittle almost. And it's like these shards. We're finding these shards were ending up downstream at these tube bends. So we thought, hey, we have clean water, right? No, we have clean water, except that there's this scale in here. So now what we had to do, we found this about just before the winter last year, not this year's, but the year before. Fortunately, we found it in time where we could introduce a kind of a chemical clean on it. We introduced sort of a really mild acid in there, which helped break that down, and we cleaned the entire system really effectively. So now we know a little bit more, again, learning as we go, right? So we're continuing finding out more about that as we go on. So it's something we'll have to be more vigilant on. And we'll also keep some more flow going through the system in the summer to make sure that anti-scaler continues to work well. So what are some of the benefits? Benefits are obviously the increased walkability. We have people that are jogging down there, walking all the time. It's a great place to bring pets that have sensitive, areas for salt and stuff and pads, and, extends the life. Talked about no freeze thaw. So the pavers that are there, the asphalt that's there lasts a long time. Fixtures. Didn't really think about this, but a lot of decorative lighting fixtures that are down there, if they're not getting hit by salt, you're not eating away at the metal in those bases. So they last a long time. All these different things that are there, obviously bringing people down there as a destination is a piece of it. And it's helping the merchants that are downtown continue to be a place where people want to go shop. It creates a wonderful environment, different from the malls where you're inside. Back to the malls have sort of gone the other way, right? I mean, we see that the West Shore Mall is not the West Shore Mall anymore. It's Grand Rapids Community College and it's other things. And yes, there are some stores that are still there, but it's not the experience that people have gravitated towards. And this is more of what continues to be a very active place as a destination. Reduced salt also is a better benefit in terms of the water impacts, and then having the porous surfaces helps with stormwater runoff. We received a lot of recognition. Weather Channel was just here, was here back in 2019, but also during the blizzard that occurred in 2020. That's an individual, not downtown. At the bottom there, he is out at the state park during the blizzard, but they interviewed the mayor and they spent time downtown too, and were very impressed with, given the extreme conditions, how well the city did, as well as the snowmelt system, which didn't perform great during the blizzard because we were dealing with 40, 50 mile an hour winds, heavy snowfall rates, but it recovered very quickly. The next day or two after the blizzard had given up, the streets were back to clear. Runner's World also focused a story on Holland and all the jogging activities that are going on back in February 2021. So a lot of notoriety that comes with that. And we get a lot of inquiries from communities too. And said, well, how can we do this in our community? It's easy. All you got to do is build a $240 million power plant and you're all set, right? So, and that kind of shuts them down. And but we've heard from different communities, Canada, overseas. There are other places that this exists. Again, I mentioned Scandinavia, Helsinki, some areas in Copenhagen, Reykjavik. There are some areas. I think some of them might rival our size in total, but it's pretty darn close. In North America, I know we have everybody beat in North America as far as that goes. Okay, so it's all great and everything like that, right? But how do we pay for it? So it's really a couple of different pieces and parts to that. One is the manifolds and the looped tubes are the distribution area. Again, that's the distribution. And when those go in, there's a contribution that's made 50% to the construction of those distribution loops by the property owner in front of those. And if you're a not-for-profit, because you're not otherwise paying taxes to the city, or you're tax exempt entities, you may have a situation where you're now 60% responsible for it and the city's 40% responsible. So that is policy that has been created on that assessment district. And then the transmission area, transmission segments, again, since 2004, the BPW has funded that, and then there's a cost recovery. The BPW charges the city. We do not just pay for it. We charge for the cost recovery on the investments that were made in the transmission, but then we also charge for the operating costs of the system as well. And under the expenses side, you can see some of those. Pumping cost takes energy to pump. So we actually charge an electric rate, energy and demand for that. So when the pumps are standing by, they're still paying for some of that demand. That's about $28,000 a year. Chemicals, the suite of chemicals that we're still doing for anti-scalant and disinfection, those are about $15,000 a year. And then there's periodic maintenance and things like that. The large portion of the expenses is actually capital recovery, about $313,000 a year to pay for an annual payment to recover those big investments that were made in transmission. So the operating assessment on the revenue side, there's some contribution from the city street fund because the city avoids plowing it. They avoid some maintenance activities. So there's some contribution there. But then there's the assessment that's given to everybody that's in front of those particular areas on an annual basis for the operating. And that's 51 cents per square foot. It used to be per linear foot back when sidewalks were fairly uniform. Well, a lot has changed with the design of different areas of the city where there's bigger areas, smaller areas. We have the Performing Arts Center, which has a major area that's snowmelted. We have parking lots now that are in the assessment. So linear feet didn't really make any sense anymore. So they went to the 51 cents per square foot. Still a pretty reasonable thing to keep that clear, especially if you're a merchant in the downtown area. And the city, where it has property in front of those areas, is paying too. So the city itself is assessed for those areas of snowmelt where that's there. Right now, we have a fund balance of about $105,000 in the fund, which is pretty good for given the annual operating expense. Things that could really change a whole lot is only about $40,000 to $50,000 if you think about the pumping and the chemical costs, right? If there was a major disruption that was there, but there are plans to grow that over the future as well. So what is next? We have some more heat available. And again, the city is kind of landed on, remember I mentioned it went from 90 BTUs per square foot in the original to 65. We kind of landed on 80 now as the design basis, 80 BTUs per square foot per hour. And so what's happening now in the near future is that unit number 6, an old combustion turbine that we had back from 1974, it burned oil. And it was used very infrequently. Well, it's reached the end of life, and we're actually pulling that out here at the end of May of this year. And that is the area where the ice skating venue is going to be going in. 6th Street is going to get a whole new streetscape of its own here over the next couple of years. So there'll be renewal of that, undergrounding of utilities that are overhead, improvement of the street and gutter and the configuration of the road. There's plans long-term to extend College Avenue to the north and actually have it tie in with 5th and then 4th Street to kind of plat those streets in. And the ice skating venue and so 6th Street will be getting some snowmelt sidewalks and street, and up to probably the railroad crossing that's there. And then I don't know if the street's getting it on the other side, but maybe some sidewalk on the other side, kind of coming in from the other area off from Central. And so that's still in the plans and final designs at this point, but that'll be happening over the next couple of years. It'll be very exciting to have the ice skating venue. And as I understand it, the plans are also in place to reject the heat from the refrigeration of the ice into being a snowmelt supplement as well. Primarily to take care of some of the areas that are around the facility. But then snowmelt can be introduced as a backup to that if that isn't available at that time. So that's really what's on the immediate horizon. I think there'll be some other discussions and thoughts around waterfront development at the end of 8th Street, which is on the table at this point too, and the possibility of bringing things further than the Civic Center that exists today going down that direction. So some big future considerations though. I mentioned it takes a power plant. What if in the effort to decarbonize our portfolio, and we are shifting, we moved away from coal to natural gas, much cleaner. We continue to put renewables in our portfolio through wind and solar, but wind and solar don't generate a waste heat for melting snow. So it takes a rejection in that thermodynamic cycle that I talked about to be able to do that. How do we do that in a situation where we're decarbonizing? Well, fortunately, I don't think that we'll have to strand the acid of snowmelt. I hope not. I think if we did, it'd be a long time out. But the other hope would be is that other fuels become available for Holland Energy Park. Hydrogen, for example, is being considered to be explored as an alternative to natural gas. And if hydrogen holds the key potentially to being able to continue to run Holland Energy Park, well, then we have a long life available for burning something that rejects heat. The other possibility is that there continues to be efforts on development of a much safer, smaller, more easily deployed nuclear technology called small modular reactors. In fact, the first small modular reactor prototypes have been approved for to be installed out west, actually in Idaho. And so you'll see more of that come around. These are about 50 megawatts in size. I don't think Holland's ready to jump into small modular reactors immediately. So I don't think we have nuclear immediately around the corner, but over the long run, there may be opportunities there that could actually be a heat source for that. There are issues that have to be faced by the city and the BPW and the residents that are in storefront owners that are part of the assessment process, is that eventually things do wear out. And that assessment right now is paying for the capital recovery of the initial installations of the transmission, but the distribution pipes were sort of paid at one time. If these become brittle and start cracking and failing, have to go in underneath the streets and sidewalks and start replacing these. How do we do that, right? So there gives some challenges in the future on finding mechanisms to fund some of those things going forward. And the other thing that could be open up some opportunities is that we may be able to find other heating and cooling integrations. And I mentioned right now that the Civic Center is using it for heating. It doesn't use it for cooling because in the summertime, we pretty much shut it down. Well, the reason we shut it down is because it actually absorbs heat from the sun beating down on the streets and sidewalks. So we don't really want to have, that used for something that's going to create additional heat that we have to reject somewhere else. But there's this idea out there, if you go back to the cooling tower that we showed before, it has a plume sometimes because it's losing water vapor. We have to make up that water vapor. And right now we're using potable water to do that from our water plant. So we're treating water for the idea of filling up the system. What if we could treat our wastewater to a point where it could actually be clean enough to be used as a makeup water source for that system instead? Well, guess what? The old power plant is right across the street from the wastewater plant. We could actually potentially use the conduit, the original transmission line that went down there, as a way of getting the wastewater flow to go through that conduit to the plant to be makeup water for the snowmelt or for the cooling tower. If we did that in the summertime, we've been moving water that's relatively cool through there, wastewater discharge. We might be able to tap that for cooling for a heat pump as opposed to looking at just for heating in the wintertime. So some interesting ideas that are out there for the future, but also some challenges, that are on the horizon. One last slide here. This is from former Mayor Al McGeehan in a radio interview with Michigan Radio back in 2016. And back in 1988, so kind of going back to that time, when the idea was first launched, it was rocket science to us. We didn't know anything about it. It had never been done before in the United States. We had no idea, number one, how it worked, we hooked it up to our power plant. We had no idea how much it was going to cost to create. And the biggest question was, how much was it going to cost to operate and maintain it? The majority, and it was a slim majority, city council said, let's dare to dream big and let's give it a shot. And that sort of kind of sums up this whole thing as far as the journey that we've been on with things in Holland in general, but specifically the Snowmelt system. So that is it. And I'd be happy to take any questions that you have on this or anything else BPW related. So thank you very much.
I have one question. Can you hear me?
Where are you at? Over here? I heard somebody with a question.
Yeah, I'm on Zoom.
On Zoom. Okay, very good. Yes, I can hear you.
I love the presentation. I had heard it maybe 4 or 5 years ago, but you've really upgraded it, and I learned a lot. One question that wasn't answered then and still seems to be the elephant in the room today. What is going to happen to the old power plant, particularly in light of your suggestions that there's going to be waterfront development? Is that the area where the development will be?
So, and thank you. If you're zooming because you're out of town, then you may have missed some recent activity. And the question was, if you didn't hear him, the question was, the elephant in the room was, what is really going to happen with the old power plant site? And is it going to be redeveloped? So, let me just say that if you're out of town, you may have missed some of this. Has been covered a little bit, but the city council recently heard a presentation. And if many of you know, again, just like we did with power generation, went through a very intentional process to create a visioning document called Waterfront Holland. City manager and I worked on that. A lot of consultants, a lot of people gave support to that process to really envision for our downtown and the areas that are connected, or for the waterfront and the areas that are connected to our downtown. What do we aspire to as a community? What do we want to see? What are the guiding principles around that development that we want? And that sets a foundation for an evaluative criteria, essentially, that we can use a lens to look at development opportunities. The catalyst property that's really in play here is the DeYoung plant. It's about a 17-acre parcel of property. And we put out a request for proposals, a request for qualifications, and then ultimately proposals for developers to consider a development opportunity at the DeYoung plant. What we got back were 3 firms that were qualified. And then when we asked for the proposals, one firm actually came back with a proposal, and that was from GDK, Geen de Kock. They're very familiar in town, done a lot of development activity. But their proposal, and we invited it, if this was an option they wanted to pursue, their proposal was to not develop at DeYoung, but to enable development elsewhere on the waterfront by moving what was there to the DeYoung site. So their proposal is to consolidate industry between Padnos and Brewers, so that Verplank would move in between the two of them, which would then open up the Verplank site and 2 adjacent properties that the city currently owns. That would be essentially between Padnos there, but then also up to Boatworks, where there would be a mixed-use development that would go in, and that mixed-use development would have transient marina, cruise ship dock, restaurant, hotel, condos, promenade, access from a walking perspective and connectivity that's there. And then some enhancements that the development would make to Collin Park as well, where they're looking at possibly retiring the old band shell and doing something new with a better performing arts area out there. So those are some things from an amenities perspective. That was reviewed with city council. We looked at the economic benefits that were accrued to that. We looked at the alignment with the Waterfront Holland vision. And then we looked at mechanisms that it would take to allow that to happen. And there are some mechanisms that were outlined there. These are all on waterfrontholland.org. So if you want to go look at that meeting and go to the news area under waterfrontholland.org, you can see the results of that last meeting, all the presentations that were made. City Council this Wednesday, tomorrow, will be considering a resolution to put ballot language on the May election that would ask the voters if they're willing to not approve the development, but to approve the city and the BPW to be enabled to sell the properties. And the reason this is that way is because although the city can sell a lot of property that it owns, if it's utility property or if it's waterfront property, it has to be brought to the voters, and there has to be a 3/5 of the voter approval of that. So a 60% positive vote. So that's where that sits at this point. And again, a lot of that information is available on waterfrontholland.org, and I invite you to check in on that. And certainly there'll be more information that will be forthcoming. And I imagine the developers themselves, because the BPW and the city can't advocate for a particular ballot question, but there will be people that will be probably, bring information forward that will, have some of that, advocacy piece to it. Our role will be to provide that information out there so there's clarity when you're going to, make your election on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Question up here.
Couple Snowmelt questions. The largest annual expense was the cost recovery. Where do you stand on sunsetting that?
Yeah, so that's been one of the big discussions that we've had, because there is a time frame where the recovery will be done on the initial investment. And so we're having discussions right now between BPW and city staff is that this isn't really like a loan. The idea, it looks like a loan, it kind of smells like a loan, but the reality is when the BPW put the investment in, just like we would with other systems, we now have a tariff or a rate structure that actually creates the cost recovery. One of the things that we have to remember is that if we're responsible for future upgrades and investments in that transmission piece, do we maybe lessen the impact, but make sure that we still create a fund that grows from the $100,000 number to something where we can more sustainably deal with those without having to go out for major bond issues or something like that. So, that's all kind of coming up as far as maybe some relaxation on it. The other thing that's out there too, I didn't mention this on 6th Street. The city manager has been able to determine that if there's development activity around what's going on with the revitalization of 6th Street, there may be some ability to use what's called tax increment financing as well. I don't know if you're familiar with that concept, but the idea there is that you divert the taxes that are above what's currently being done right now to be able to pay for qualified infrastructure improvements. So there may be some opportunity to use that on some future expansions as well, where it makes sense. So, but yeah, those are things that we're discussing because, we don't want to get to a point where sometime down the road, we got to do all this work and there's nothing, in the balance. But we also know that there's fairness in terms of those that are using it, paying for it as opposed to those that aren't using it, paying for it. So there's some finessing that has to happen with that.
Thank you. And you briefly talked about the life expectancy of the distribution system, the loops and things.
Yeah.
Any projections on that date?
Yeah, that's a great question. I leave a little bit to that Brian White, our engineer in the city, but we're at 30, what are we at right now? 1988 or 35 years at this point. I think there's thoughts that we're 50 to 60 years kind of numbers. It's, it does depend a little bit on how we treat them. The other thing that can be done, good news is you can pull up pavers pretty easily. So if you don't have major areas that you're dealing with, these are actually little connectors, so you can cut with a tool, just cut the tube, put this sleeve on it, put another piece of tube in, you're back in business again. So, if it gets to be where we're starting to see chronic issues with that, then we would probably then look at addressing that at that point. But, we'll be doing repairs probably for a while before we would get to that point.
What is the heat limitation on expansion?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, if you go back to where we are today, I think I had that in there, right? So the system of today is around, let me get back to that here. Yeah, we're about 56 million BTUs per hour. The condenser at full load of the steam turbine is closer to like 180. So we have some room yet to grow that system. Now, that being said, when you start doing that, you start creating constraints around it, right? You need to then be making sure you're operating the plant full out all the time. And that's the other thing is there's times where we're managing our power supply to the community based upon deciding whether it comes out of Holland Energy Park or it comes from a grid or it comes from different sources of electricity. And so, if we don't have flexibility in that, you may be running uneconomically just to make sure you're creating enough heat for the snowmelt system. So, that could start causing a situation where you're starting to go, okay, there needs to be more in the operating cost of the snowmelt system to make sure the electric payers are held whole. As it exists today, there's the ability to create that flexibility because we're dealing with 56 million out of a total of 180 or so million that's available there per hour. So I think we have some ability to grow, but we also probably don't want to push it right to the very limit of what that capability is. Yeah.
Hi. How does the water maintain its heat the further it gets away from the power plant?
That's a great question. So again, what you want is you want the water losing its heat when it gets into these tubes. But you want it staying in when it's in these tubes. And so part of what's there naturally is the fact that these are very thick wall. Okay. And the surface that where you'd lose that energy is here. So the surface to volume, it's a pretty low amount of surface to volume that's here in these bigger tubes. So just by that nature, what we found, and this is part of Pete's smart tubes or smart bricks as well, is that if we're discharging at about 95 degrees, we've measured temperatures down by the end of Central Avenue near Evergreen Commons. And we've only lost about 2 to 3 degrees in that transmission all the way there. So it's really doing a great job staying in the larger tubes. And then, of course, once it leaves that and gets to the manifolds, we want it coming out. We want it, losing that heat as quickly as possible at that time. And again, that's because we're dealing with, as far as surface to volume now, it's much more surface to the smaller volume that's in here. So we're getting a better heat transfer going on with that. So yeah, and there's other mechanisms they do too to try to create more of an insulating material around that. But it's mostly just the thickness of the pipe that's doing that. Yeah. Great question.
Question about the street systems that are they always included with the adjoining sidewalk? Or are there some streets that only have sidewalk and nothing in the street?
Right. There are many areas where it's only sidewalk. That's not on there anymore. So, but yeah, it's actually mostly the area right now that street and sidewalk is between like Columbia and the farmers market now has both on 8th Street. And then 6th Street is also going to have some street area, but everywhere else right now is just pretty much sidewalk. Another thing that we had to do over the years too, some people had gone before us and had actually boilers that they had in some of their businesses. And they said, hey, can you hook our system in? Well, these boilers were producing water to, again, about that 135, 140 degrees. And so the systems they had were set up for wider tubing spacing and things like that. So when we integrated, also now it's 95-degree water. So they were sort of suffering in those areas on those sidewalks. So we have also incorporated some private systems in, but then had to recognize that they might need to make some adjustments in that operation over time.
When the water goes down those small pipes, it has to come back to the plant. Is that a whole other system?
No, so the distribution system that goes out, what you'll have is you'll have a supply and a return kind of next to each other. And I thought maybe there might be, I don't know if I've got a picture of that here that shows that pretty well. Let me see if I do. I thought there was one here near the expansion discussion. Let me see here. But yes, they run parallel to each other. And yeah, there you go. So here's an example right here where you have these two right next to each other, right? So the one's going out into the loop, and then the other one's coming back into the return. And then that line is going back to so one's coming out to it and the other one's going back into the plant. And so that's how that manages those zones that are there. And again, this is like one zone, and then there's another zone a little bit further up, and all those are individually sort of supplied by the by the larger lines, about these size, 3-inch or so, and then going into the manifolds, which break it down to the 1-inch tubing at that point. So one going out, and then the loop comes back to the separate one, and it runs right along with it. And that's also, if you look at the, if I go to the picture here too of the new system that was put in for Holland Energy Park, same thing there. One of them is the supply, and the other one is the return going back on the much larger piping. Yeah.
Is there a cost savings to those businesses that are connecting their boilers?
Yeah, there are, because right now they're firing a boiler and they're burning fuel in that boiler, and they're doing it directly to heat the sidewalks, where this is using the waste heat. So they're paying for the assessment, but assessment is say 51 cents per square foot, right? So if you have a sidewalk that's about 10 feet wide, and maybe their storefront's about 50 feet or 60 feet, we're talking about 600 square feet. It's $300 of an assessment over a year, 50 cents on 600 square feet. So, if you operate a boiler, you have to maintain it, you have to fire it with fuel, all those different things now go away. And so the fuel itself, if you think about having to burn that gas just to provide that heat so it's dissipating in the sidewalks, it's a lot of fuel being burned. So yes, we found that if we had to shut down the power plant and put a boiler in to create 51 million BTUs per hour, right? So natural gas right now is about $4 on the open market per million BTU. So we're talking about to operate the system, you know, what are you about $200 to $300 an hour just on the energy usage that's going in. You start adding that, you multiply that by 24 hours a day, you know, throughout the season, you know, you really start adding up, you know,
I
those
thought
numbers.
they were Putting heat into the system from their boiler, excess heat was going into the. system.
No, if they had a private system, then they're firing the boiler. Well, most cases, it's specifically set up for the operation of the Snowmelt system. And therefore they're firing fuel just for that. Now, if they have something where they have a waste heat source somehow, but you only really have a waste heat source if you're using heat for something and then there's residual that's left over for something else. I don't know many areas that would have that. Like if they use it for building heating and they use their condensate for that, they might be able to get some efficiency for that. But essentially, you know, you really don't have to put in more heat than what you need for your primary use. And any new energy that's being used has to be made up by the fuel. There's no real place where that's otherwise coming from. So I think that's pretty low value that they'd be getting for that.
Aquatic Center, since they put in a little bit of Snowmelt.
Yeah,
there, and
yeah.
You think they would have excess heat to.
Yeah, I still think that's probably costing them more than what it'd be if they connected in. Now, the challenge with the Aquatic Center, and I know they'd love to have it, is the logistics of moving the system that far to catch their building. They're not really along the route in a way that would allow for that to happen very easily.
I've been
I
impressed in the
think we're
present.
at our time limit, and Dave will
I'll
be
stick
happy to
around.
talk to you individually
Yeah.
afterwards. Help me thank Dave for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.